Hi, my name is Harry Parker, and I'm currently a student at Jones Technical Institute, also known as JTech, here in Jacksonville. I'm going through the automotive technician program. Really good program. If you're interested in being an automotive technician, I encourage you to, possibly look into getting some formal education. But today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to service the transmission on this 2001 Ford Ranger XLT. The first point that I need to bring up is, when is transmission service recommended or required per the manufacturer? The manufacturer recommends that you do a transmission service every 30,000 miles. Anytime that you operate for an extended period of time at high speeds in temperatures over 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Or another time is if you tow a decent load more than 1,000 miles. And the last time that they recommend that you do it is anytime that you accumulate more than 5,000 miles in a month. Before we get started with doing this project, I want to talk a little bit about safety. Number one, the first thing that you want to consider is making sure that you have a pair of safety rated safety glasses or goggles to make sure that you don't get any debris in your eyes, and you want to prevent any possible injury. The other thing you may want to consider is the use of gloves. But those two things at a minimum, you should definitely make sure that you consider. The next thing I want to discuss is how to prep your work area. This particular truck, it's lifted. It already has a lot of ground clearance on it. Not all Rangers are lifted. One of the things that you want to be able to do is you want to be able to get the vehicle high enough off the ground so that you can safely and comfortably work underneath it. So to accomplish that, you need to make sure that you have a proper size jack. Here's two types of jacks here. We have a floor jack and we have a bottle jack. You're going to want to not rely on this having it in the air, so you're going to want to use the proper size jack stands to support the vehicle. And also, you're going to want to chalk your wheels to make sure that it doesn't roll back while it's lifted, while it's in the air, while you're working underneath it. Another thing that you're going to need before we start discussing the individual tools is you're going to need a drain pan to drain the fluid into. I use this flat pan. I got it from Harley Davidson. I prefer to use it to do all of my services on the vehicles because it has a good large area. It's low to the ground. It's just my preferred. There's a lot of different types that you can use. The other thing that I do is I like to use one of these pans, catch pans, so that I can minimize the amount of mess that I have underneath the vehicle. When you start draining fluids, they tend to make a mess. So this is one of the things that you want to consider as well. Now we're going to prep the vehicle so that we can go ahead and safely work on it. I've already set the parking brake. You want to make sure that you set your parking brake or emergency brake. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to chalk my tires to have an additional safety precaution that it doesn't roll back. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get me a little bit more ground clearance. So I'm going to go ahead and raise the vehicle and place the jack stands. Okay, with my safety glasses on, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start raising the vehicle. You want to be able to put the jack in a safe place where it's not going to slip off, and you have a good foundation so that you can start raising it up. I've already set the first jack stand. I'm going ahead and I'm setting the second jack stand now. Okay, she's safely on the jacks, stands, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave the jack underneath it. Not relying on the jack, I'm just leaving it underneath it for a little extra support. Now that we've got the vehicle prepped, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start talking about the tools that are required to do this service. The next thing we're going to talk about is the minimum basic tools required to perform this service. Number one, you're definitely going to want a light source. You're underneath the vehicle, there's limited light there. You want to be able to see what you're doing, so light source. The next thing you're going to need is a 1/2-inch drive, socket set. You could also use a 3/4-inch drive. There's some tight places up in there, so I've elected to use my 1/2-inch drive. Once I get the bolts loose, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my cordless impact driver to go ahead and finish removing the bolts so I can cut down on a little bit of time. Remember, if you're going to be using power equipment, it's okay to go ahead and use it in disassembly, but not for reassembly. For reassembly, you want to make sure that everything is torqued to specs. So you're going to use an inch-pound torque wrench. That's for assembly. Once you've removed the pan and have drained the fluid, you're going to have to prepare the pan so that it can accept a new gasket. So you're going to want, number one, you're going to want some type of pry bar or flat tip screwdriver to aid with breaking loose the transmission pan. You're going to need a putty knife or gasket scraper to help you get the gasket off. And then I like to use this wire wheel to finish getting any debris off that or residue from the gasket. The last thing that you're going to need for a tool is when you get your pan off, you're going to need a peening hammer so that you can peen your pan. So those are the basic tools that I'll be using today to do this service. Before I start taking the bolts out, what I normally do is I always just go ahead and pull the transmission dipstick, which is located right here on the passenger side of engine, right in the middle. Transmission dipstick. And then we'll move underneath the vehicle. Okay, now that we're underneath the vehicle, we can see where we have to start working. per the book, they actually recommend that you remove this heat shield right here. It kind of curls down. But one of the things that I've learned, because I have serviced this transmission before, is that step's not really necessary. But I wanted to point that out because that is what the book calls for. The second thing that I need to point out with this transmission is the next step would be to loosen all of these 18 bolts, and then you would leave 2 or 3 bolts in so that the pan could drop slightly, and then that way you can control the spillage of the fluid coming out of the transmission. I don't need to do that because I tow so much that I have a temperature gauge inside my vehicle so that I can monitor my transmission for overheating. So this is a temp sensor, and it's also a drain plug. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start my process by just draining the fluid using the drain plug here via temp sensor. And once that's done, I'll show you the technique that you need to use to drop the pan so that you can minimize the amount of splash that you get. Okay, I've disconnected my temperature sensor, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the sensor, which also serves as the drain plug, and then I'm going to start draining my transmission fluid this way. This is definitely something that you may want to consider if you plan on keeping up with the service on your vehicle, because it makes it a lot more simple and a lot less messy. So we'll go ahead and we're just going to let this drain and drip out, and then we'll come back to it in a couple minutes. Okay, I'm breaking all the bolts loose by hand. I don't like to overuse the power because I don't like to wrench on my bolts, and I try to minimize the amount of damage that I do to them. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the impact driver to get the rest of them out. Okay, as I already told you before, we're leaving these 2 front bolts in. What we are going to do is we're going to loosen them down just a little bit to give that pan a little bit more room so that it can drop. Now with all the bolts removed except for the 2 front, and with the 2 front dropped down probably about half of the thread, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pop the pan loose, and we're going to drain the transmission. So now's the time to make sure that you get your drain pan in place. Also make sure that you take out the plugs in the drain pan so that the fluid can actually go where it's supposed to go. And what I'm going to do right now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a pry bar up in here. I'm going to catch the lip and I'm going to start prying on it to get it freed up. And I'm going to work it all the way around. Okay, I'm going to loosen up these bolts a little more in the front. And then what you're going to do is with the pry bar or with your hands, you're going to pull down on the pan. And the fluid would start splashing out from this corner right here, the driver's side rear corner. Once the fluid is finished draining, you can go ahead and you can take out the two front bolts. And right here, you can see the pan dropping down. More of the fluid would be spilling out right here into your drain pan. And now you're ready to remove the pan. Okay, now the pan is free. Just gonna have to work it. See a little bit more fluid. We'll go ahead and let it splash out. The old gasket came off. So we'll just go ahead and we'll let that pan drip out. And the next thing that we're going to do, once it stops dripping a little bit more, we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove and replace the transmission filter, which is located right here. I'll show you that here in a second once it stops dripping. Now with the pan removed and the bottom of the transmission and the valve body exposed, the next step in servicing the transmission is going to be to remove the transmission filter, which is right here. And what you're going to need is an 11mm socket to remove that nut. I didn't mention this before, but the 18 bolts on the transmission pan are a size 13mm. The transmission filter retaining bolt is removed, and the filter has worked its way loose. Okay, the next thing that we got to do is we'll go ahead and we'll let this continue to drip with your pan underneath it. And we'll go ahead and we'll start prepping for the reinstallation of the new filter and preparing the pan and the gasket for pan reinstallation. Okay, now that the pan and the filter has been removed, the next thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you got the correct filter and gasket from the parts store. There's a lot of different transmissions they can put in several of these vehicles. There's always a possibility that a transmission has been swapped out somewhere down the line and you could come back with the wrong part. But in this case, I went ahead and I purchased the correct filter at Napa Auto Parts. So the next thing that I'll point out is that we need to go ahead and we need to prep for reinstallation. the transmission is still draining from the valve body, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work on the pan. But one of the things I want to call to your attention is right here. There's a magnet, and one of the things that you kind of want to look for in your pan is the color and condition of the fluid, which in this case it's very good because I actually change my fluid frequently. You want to see if there's any paper residue, something that look like little shards of paper, because or metal or anything in your pan that might reflect that there's some kind of internal damage. So one of the things that you want to do is a visual inspection. The fluid looks good. There's no metal shavings. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean my pan. I'll use a combination of soapy water and parts cleaner to make sure that I can get this prepared nicely. Now, one of the things that I also need to point out is because I recently serviced the transmission, my filter came off clean. So there's really not going to be a large need to do any scraping or anything like that. So a lot of times there will be, though, especially if a cork gasket is involved. You can have portions of the gasket stuck to the pan, but then also stuck to the bottom of the transmission as well. So you want to make sure both of those two surfaces are clean and you're going back together clean. So I'm going to go ahead and clean and prep the pan. I've gone ahead and I've wiped down the pan a little bit, but one thing I can notice is there is a little bit of residue right here. So I'm not going to use the scraper, but I'm going to go ahead and use my cordless drill with a wire brush, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to buff it up. Make sure that it's clean as possible for that new gasket. If you don't have a drill and a wire brush for the drill, you can go ahead and just use any steel wire brush to go ahead and do the same thing. It's just going to take you a little bit longer to get it done. Now that I've got the transmission, pan, gasket surface wire brushed and cleaned up super nice, and also have cleaned up the mating surface on the actual transmission around the valve body, cleaned up nice. The next thing to do is you're going to want to peen your pan. And the reason why you want to do this is you want to put the pan back in its original configuration. What happens is when you tighten these bolts up and you tighten it, it compresses. And when it compresses, it actually can and sometimes will cause a dimple effect by pressing the hole upward. And when that happens, there's a possibility that you could end up with a leak. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and peen the pan. So the way that you do that is you get your ball peen hammer. So to peen the pan, what you want to do is you want to be able to dress this lip right here on another flat surface. You can use 2x4 or 4x4. You can use a steel area, someplace somewhat sturdy. And what you're going to do is you're just going to go around the pan and you're going to hit every one of these holes and you're going to knock it back down. Now that the pan is clean, we're ready to go ahead and just start laying out the gasket. Because it's been folded up in a box for a long period of time, I'm just going to let it warm up, get to room temperature, and get to where it'll lay better. But one thing I want to point out while that is going on is on this surface right here, you're going to want to prepare it in a manner that the gasket can stick, and it'll aid with lining up the holes and getting the pan back on. So one of the things that can help you out with that is using Vaseline, petroleum jelly, so that the gasket can go ahead and stick to that. The reason why you want to use Vaseline, petroleum jelly, is the petroleum jelly will not contaminate the transmission fluid. Okay, I put a layer of petroleum jelly on the bottom of the pan on the mating surface. I got the gasket to where it would lay flat. So I'm going to put that aside, and I'm going to prepare the filter for reinstallation. So the kit's going to come with a couple of new O-rings. There's one that's larger, there's one that's smaller, and that's pretty much self-explanatory. You're going to put those O-rings over their respective sleeves, and you also get a new bolt to go ahead and reinstall the filter. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get that filter reinstalled right now. All right, reinstalling the filter. You're going to put the bigger sleeve into the bigger hole. You're going to put the smaller sleeve into the smaller hole. You're going to line it up. Okay. It'll snap into place, and it'll almost hold itself. Reinstall the filter retaining bolt. Now in the manual, I did not see a torque spec for this bolt. And the new bolt that they gave us is a different size. So I'm going to have to get the correct size socket for that. Now that I got the correct socket, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run it down to where it's hand tight. And what I'm going to do is, with not a lot of force, I'm going to tighten it down just a little more, because you do not want to over tighten this. Filter's installed. So now we can go ahead and we can reinstall the pan. Okay, we're going to reinstall the pan. We're going to start a couple bolts. Once you get them all, the bolts started, you can go ahead and use your ratchet So go ahead and snug them up. And only snug them up because you're going to use a torque wrench set in inch-pounds to set the torque on these bolts. We've gotten all the transmission pan bolts snagged up with the ratchet. We're going to go ahead and we're going to set the bolts to its final torque setting. Now the book calls for, or the manufacturer calls for, on the low side 115 inch-pounds, and on the high side it calls for 133 inch-pounds. So I went ahead and I set this torque wrench at 125. And what you're going to do is you're going to start at one point and you're going to torque them. And there it goes. Okay, now that I've gone all the way around once and I've set the torque setting, I'm going to go around one more time and just make sure that I didn't miss a bolt. Now that the torque setting is complete, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reinstall the temp sensor. And again, the only reason why I have to do this is because I've installed the temp sensor. If you don't have one, you would move on to the next step, which is going to be to start filling the transmission back up. Okay. Now that we've got the transmission serviced, our next step is we're going to have to top it off with fluid because we removed fluid. So we're going to have to re-add the amount that we took out. To do that, you must be on level surface. So my next step is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get it off the jack stands. I'm going to lower it. I'm going to get it to level. This particular transmission, it actually calls for Mercron 5 or Merc 5. You want to make sure that you're using the right transmission fluid for your proper transmission, or it's not going to operate correctly and you could impact the life of the transmission. Now, according to the manufacturer, they say to add 4 quarts. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with 4 quarts. Then we're going to let it run. We're going to shift it through all the gears to make sure that the fluid is going through all the different shift valves and that we get the proper level. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put 4 quarts in and then we'll start it. Now that I put 4 quarts of Merc 5 back into the transmission through the dipstick tube. I started the vehicle, I'm beginning to let it warm up. It needs to get to operating temperature so that we can get an accurate reading of the transmission fluid. But one of the other things we got to do is we got to pass through all the gears, make sure that, like I just previously mentioned, that the fluid circulating through all the different shift valves. Once we let it run for a little bit longer, still not quite up to operating temperature yet. Once it is, we'll go ahead and check it, and at that point we'll go underneath it to make sure that we don't have any leaks around the pan gasket. Now that we've gotten to the proper operating temperature, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check my level. Now, when we talk about normal operating temperature, there's two different temperatures. The actual transmission, this particular transmission, the normal operating temperature is 160 degrees. Because I have two transmission coolers in it, it's lower than that, so it's about 140. But if you don't have a transmission temperature gauge, just go off of the car's water temperature, or the thermostat reading in the car. When we're taking a look at the reading on the dipstick, one thing I want to point out is there's some residual fluid right here. So it actually looks like the transmission has too much fluid in it. That's not the case. Right here you have a bare spot, and then it gets wet again. Now this wet part right here is the actual reading. This right here is residual from when we were filling the transmission. It just hasn't seeped all the way back into the pan yet. So we're really going to pay attention to what's right here. Right now it looks like we're still a little bit low. We want to get just barely above this line. You do not want to exceed this line, and the reason why is your fluid is going to start getting overfilled to the point that it's going to get driven up into the valve body, and that's going to cause transmission operating problems. So too little fluid, no good. Too much fluid, no good. You got to get it just right within your parameter right here. So I'll go ahead, I'm going to add a little bit more, and then I'll check it again. I just put another half a quart of Merc 5 in. I'm pretty happy with my fluid level right now. So the final step is going to be to go ahead and get underneath it and make sure that I don't have any gasket leaks of any kind. So I'm going to go ahead and get under there and test it. Safety glasses on. Everything looks good, no leaks. This transmission service is now complete. Now that I've checked for leaks, I know my fluid level is good. The only thing left to do now is just take it out for a test drive and just make sure that it's shifting smooth the way it should be. So this concludes my video demonstration on how to do a transmission service on a 2001 Ford Ranger XLT. Thank you.